Today's topic is about soil preparation. We here at the Greenery get a lot of inquiries about how to improve soil prior to adding plants to the garden. And with any good gardening, soil preparation is probably one of the most important things you can do. A lot of people are tempted to take a plant home and plant it straight into our soils in this area, which are all renowned for being very heavy clay soils. And 9 out of 10 times the plants will fail because there hasn't been any preparation work done. So it's really important to spend some time and getting the soil right before you consider planting anything into the garden. Now, if it was a new garden that was just being established, one of the main problems in this area is they're generally very heavy clay based soils, as is a lot of the soils in Melbourne. If you live in coastal areas or bayside suburbs in Melbourne, the soils are generally a bit lighter and sandier. But the nature of Melbourne soils overall are that they're clay based. And they need a fair bit of work to get them to the stage where they can actually take plants. One thing I might mention first up, if you're trying to work existing soil that's very heavy clay, if that soil is really wet and you're trying to cultivate it or rotary hoe it or whatever it might be that you need to do to it, you immediately start breaking down the structure of the soil. You can't work or cultivate clay soils without destroying the soil structure, and that's regardless of what you're intending to add to it. So it's always better to try and avoid working when clay soil is particularly wet. So if there's saturated soils, you're better off just leaving it, so at least if they can, let them dry out a little bit before you do anything to them. It's always good practice to do that. It's not an exact science, soil preparation, so there's various products you can add to soils to improve them prior to planting. A lot of people have their own favourite things that they use to try and condition soils, and I might add that any organic matter added to soil is going to improve that soil in some regard. A lot of the favourite ones are things like composts, because they're generally safe to use around most plants, and they're beneficial to most plants. The main thing you need to be careful of there is if some of the compost, if you're making your own compost at home, for instance, and you're been adding certain types of fertilisers to your compost. Some people add things like blood and bone, or they might add a high phosphorus type fertiliser. You just need to be conscious of using those sort of products around, say, native plants in the garden, because it can be toxic. So the native plants, they've been growing on soils that haven't got a lot of phosphorus in them. So just be conscious of what it is that you're intending to plant in the garden and what it is that you're putting into the soil to improve it. But generally any organic matter is going to help. One of our favourite ones here, it has been for many years, is the Surecrop organic compost, and that's a blend of different organic matter things. It's got manure in it, it has got compost in it. It's a great soil conditioner. Normally it needs to be well incorporated into the soil at the time before you're actually putting the plants in. But it's safe to use generally on most plants, even native plants, that would be fine. A new one is the Zoo-Grow, which has a variety of products in it, including manures from the Melbourne Zoo. And it has other additional things added to it, including compost, got grass clippings in it. It has straw from the animal bedding, that sort of thing. Again, it's organic, so it's great for most plants in the garden, and a good soil conditioner. When you're trying to improve soils, one of the main things you try to do is improve the structure of the soil so the plants are going to grow a lot better. So the better the soil structure, the more organic content in the soil, then the better the plants will do, generally. Adding products also helps with improving soil aeration, so it opens up the soil to allow more oxygen into the root system, helps with drainage, and it also helps with feeding the plants as well. Well, they're actually a good base product to hold nutrients in the soil, so if you're adding other things at a later stage like fertilizers such as the blood and bones, the organic matter in the soil has got more ability to hold those fertilizers and make them more available to the plant. An old favourite that's used is cow manure, particularly for vegetable gardens. There's various animal manures on the market. A lot of people tend to favour the safer manures like cow manure. It's less, it's not as strong as some of the manures, less likely to burn the root system of the plant, particularly new, say, vegetable seedlings that you might be incorporating into your garden. High nitrogen type manures like poultry manure are stronger, and they are favoured a lot with some vegetable growers, particularly leafy vegetables. They're good for things like cabbage and broccoli and lettuce and what have you. Using a garden fork is one of the best ways to mix through soil, mix through compost or manures into the existing garden soil. At the same time, it aerates the soil and it incorporates those mixes really well. And they're easy to use inside, trying to dig with a spade or a shovel and trying to incorporate product. For heavier type soils, at the same time, it's worth adding things like gypsum. Gypsum is what is called a soil flocculator, for the want of a better word. Flocculator. It's the way gypsum works. It actually binds, when you're using on heavy soils, it actually binds the clay particles in the soil together, so that they become smaller and become more open, or make the soil more open. So if you were to use, but the thing is, gypsum on its own, if you don't have any organic matter added at the same time, just reverts, the soil just reverts back to how it was before. So if you're using gypsum in the garden, you always need to add organic matter at the same time. Otherwise the soil just goes back to how it was. But it is beneficial to add it. You can buy it as a dry application, like a dry powder. Normally around about 1 kilo per square metre is the recommended rate, so it's used quite heavily on the garden. It doesn't affect the pH of the soil. A lot of people are worried about what effect it's going to do with the pH. It has no effect on pH. It's always worth adding, probably at soil conditioning time, some type of fertiliser as well, particularly if you're preparing new garden beds, or you've brought in new soil into the area. Often the soils that you buy don't have much additive to them. There's no organics in them and no fertiliser in them. So it's always worthwhile adding some sort of fertiliser, either when you're putting the plants in the ground or after you've planted, just to help the plants establish. Blood and bones, an old favourite. It's a safe fertiliser, particularly for vegetable gardens. Yes, it's got an odour, but it does have quite a slow release effect on plants, and it's not likely to burn, safe to use around veggies and all those sort of things. Osmocote is another one. That's a chemical fertiliser, particularly good for trees when you're planting trees or shrubs. It's easy to incorporate some Osmocote around the plant or in the hole when you're planting, just to help them establish. It's a slow release fertiliser, lasts generally about 3 to 4 months. So it's convenient in the sense you only have to use it maybe twice a year. Maybe once in the autumn, once in the spring, and that'll keep the plants going. If you're not a gardener that's there or gardening every week, if you want convenience, then Osmocote's the way to go. One thing probably I'd advise in Melbourne soils, because they are clay-based, they generally what they call acid type soils, rather than alkaline soils. If you live in a bayside suburb or a coastal garden and the soils are sandy, those soils generally tend to be alkaline because of the nature of the sand. It doesn't hold a lot of nutrients, so as a result the soil tends to be very alkaline. Most Melbourne soils, being clay, are generally acidic soils. So you find the pH generally is pretty stable, particularly on acidic soils. It doesn't vary much, but some people like to do a pH soil test, particularly when they're planting vegetable gardens on a regular basis, just to make sure they've got the pH level right. The beauty of these chemical testing kits, they'll give you a fairly accurate result as to what your soil might be. If you're continuously adding fertilisers to, say, a vegetable garden over a period of time, then the acidity level generally is higher. So occasionally, say once a year, you might have to add something like lime or Dynamite Lime to the soil, and it's often done in the winter time when there's not many veggies in the garden bed. If you add lime, it makes the soil more alkaline. So you're feeding continuously, say, through the summer with veggies that are using a lot of fertiliser, then the acidity level tends to increase, and you need to balance that every year by adding something like garden lime through the winter. So you've come to get the plants in the ground, and it's always worth adding some sort of liquid nutrition to the plant when you put it into the ground to get them established. The favourite has always been Seasol, and a lot of people don't realise it's not actually a fertiliser. Seasol is like a health tonic. It just helps the roots establish. If the plant's a bit stressed or poor, then this will help just settle it down. It doesn't feed the plant. A lot of people come in asking for Seasol and use it with nothing else in the garden. It doesn't feed your plant. All it does is just help the roots get going, help the plant settle in. It's a good idea to use it maybe every 10 to 14 days while the plants are establishing, for the first couple of months maybe. If you mix it with something like, and there's various types of liquid fertilisers, but if you mix it with something like Powerfeed, that is a fertiliser, and that's going to kick the plant into growth. It's going to encourage root establishment, and it's also going to get the plant growing. And you can mix the two together. You can mix this with other fertilisers as well. Dry soils, never plant onto dry soils. You always need to make sure the soil is moist before any plant goes into the ground. The plant will be continuously stressed if it's been planted into a dry soil. So a lot of good soil prep has to be done, weeks in advance, days in advance, to make sure that the soil is ready to take the plant. A lot of people like incorporating organic matter and leave the garden to sit fallow for, say, 2 or 3 months prior to planting. Most people are keen to get the garden planted straight away, so they don't leave enough time for the ground to settle and for the organics to start working in the soil itself. So you really need to sort of think about that. We're all in a hurry, we all want things done quickly, but it's better for the plants if the soil's allowed to establish first. Dry soils particularly will benefit from adding things like saturate, which is a wetting agent and encourages water into the soil. This doesn't hold water in the soil, it just gets water into the soil. There are products you can get if the soil was drying out quickly and you wanted to retain moisture around the root system. You can get wetting granules which you can put in around the root system. Adding organic matter will also help with that. The saturate is just a wetting agent. It just gets the water into the soil. Have you ever seen where the water beads on the soil? If it's a very dry soil, the water runs off, it doesn't actually penetrate. And they use things like saturate to encourage the water in the soil. That starts working straight away. But avoid planting into soils that are really dry. It's just as I say, good soil preparation is the key to having success in the garden.